The story of Alfred Schmid does not begin with the roar of cannon, but with the precise, measured tick of a clock. Nestled in the strict, orderly heart of pre-war Switzerland, his childhood was shaped by two opposing forces: the rigid, unyielding principles of his father, a watchmaker for whom perfection was the only standard, and the quietly rebellious world of mechanics in his mother's shed. While other boys dreamed of mountain pastures, young Alfred found his sanctuary among greased gears, discarded engines, and the challenge of making broken things work again. His father saw this as a distraction from serious trades, but it was here that Alfred developed a unique understanding of force, trajectory, and the intimate relationship between a man and his tool. This silent education was soon channeled into a sanctioned hobby: marksmanship. On the ranges of the Schweizer Schützenverein, his natural patience and mechanical intuition made him not just a good shot, but an exceptional one. He didn't just hit the target, he understood the wind, the humidity, the very heartbeat affecting the bullet's path. By the time dark clouds gathered over Europe in 1939, Schmid was already a craftsman. But his material was not brass and steel, it was silence, observation, and the single decisive shot. When war engulfed the continent and Switzerland mobilized, Alfred volunteered not out of fiery patriotism, but out of a deep, ingrained sense of duty, another lesson from his father's house. The army, however, was where the scattered pieces of his life suddenly clicked into a deadly, purposeful whole. The recruiters quickly noted his file: expert marksman, mechanically adept, preternaturally calm. He was not placed in a standard infantry unit. Instead, he was funneled into specialized training as an observer and sniper, roles that demanded his peculiar blend of patience, technical skill, and solitary focus. In the high alpine observatories and during field exercises, he learned to read a landscape like a map of potentialities, seeing not just hills and trees, but fields of fire, concealed approaches, and fatal funnels. It became clear to his instructors that Schmid saw battle differently, as a complex mechanism to be understood and then disrupted with minimal applied force. Yet the foundational trauma that forged his icy resolve remained hidden. Just before his deployment to the border, he received a letter. His stoic, demanding father, the man who had taught him that every flaw must be eliminated, had quietly abandoned his family and fled to Liechtenstein, leaving behind only debts and a broken watch. The very principle of Swiss reliability had shattered. In that moment, Alfred Schmid understood that some breaches cannot be mended, only guarded against, and he vowed to become that unbreakable guard. By 1940, Switzerland was not a nation, but a bristling porcupine trapped in a wolf's den. The fall of France was not just a geopolitical catastrophe, it was the slamming of a gigantic door, leaving the Confederation completely surrounded by the Axis powers. The myth of the Alpine fortress became a national mantra, a desperate prayer solidified in steel and concrete. Alfred Schmid, now a corporal, witnessed this transformation from the inside. His world narrowed to a sector along the restless Rhine, where the river seemed less a natural border and more a tense, shimmering line drawn in the sand of Europe. The idyllic landscape was now a fortified chessboard. Ancient stone bridges were meticulously mined, tunnel entrances were concealed in mountain slopes, and every village square could transform into a strongpoint in hours. The Swiss mobilization was total, a phenomenon of eerie efficiency, where bankers, farmers, and teachers seamlessly donned uniforms, their civilian lives folded away like ephemeral maps. For Schmid, this period was a relentless drill in applied geometry. He spent days charting distances to every crossroads, hollow, and river bend in his sector, his maps transforming into mosaics of potential kill zones. It was abstract, a theoretical war against phantom invaders, drawn as arrows on acetate. But the ghosts soon gained weight and sound. From their observation posts they could hear and sometimes see the German patrols on the opposite bank, the distant grumble of armored cars, the glint of field glasses catching the sun. The war was no longer a radio broadcast. It was a palpable breath on the back of their necks. The abstract threat materialized with terrifying clarity during a reconnaissance patrol deeper into the border zone. Schmid's unit was observing a valley road when the ground began to tremble with a rhythmic metallic thrum. From behind a distant tree line, a column of German Panzer II and III tanks emerged, not in attack, but in a blatant display of muscular reconnaissance, a test of nerves. Through his scissorscope, he didn't see symbols of blitzkrieg. He saw specific, monstrous problems. He studied the way the lead tank's turret rotated with predatory slowness, how the infantry dismounted behind its bulk, the vulnerable gap between hull and turret. His sergeant muttered statistics about their armor, but Schmid was calculating more intimate variables: the time it would take for a crew to hatch open, the blind spot behind the rear drive sprocket, the trajectory a grenade would need to arc into an open commander's cupola. This was the new face of war, and the standard-issue 7.5-centimeter infantry gun beside him suddenly felt pathetically slender. That night, in the damp silence of his bunker, the image of those steel beasts wouldn't fade. He understood with chilling certainty that the coming battle would not be fought between lines of men, but between men and machines. His meticulously drawn fields of fire were now highways for 40-ton monsters. The Alpine fortress had walls, but its gates were the valley passes, and against the concentrated punch of a panzer column, they were made of plywood. A quiet, cold anger replaced his initial dread. They were not just defending borders, they were defending a way of life that his own father had abandoned, and Schmid decided that if a tank was to enter his valley, it would do so over his broken body and leave its own burning behind. The tension broke not with a thunderous invasion, but with the silent, oily cut of a rubber raft slicing through the black waters of the Rhine. In the pre-dawn gloom of a foggy morning in late 1941, German Brandenburger commandos, experts in infiltration and sabotage, attempted a pinprick operation to sever a key communication line and test the Swiss response. Alfred Schmid's unit, now on high alert after months of eerie quiet, was waiting. The first sign was not a sight, but a sound, the faint metallic click of wire cutters carried over the still river. Schmid, on watch in a forward listening post, didn't raise an alarm. He froze, becoming an extension of the fog-shrouded earth, his breath shallow. He tracked the muffled footsteps, visualizing their path towards the concealed cable hub. His calculated patience was a weapon. He waited until the shadows coalesced into 3 figures, their forms bulky with equipment, before he silently slid back and triggered a prearranged flare. The sudden, blinding white light petrified the commandos for 2 critical seconds, a lifetime in the kill zone. Swiss machine gun fire, pre-sighted on the approaches, erupted from the bluff, not to hit, but to herd. The Germans scrambled for cover, right into Schmid's field of fire. Armed with the cumbersome Panzerbuchs of 41, a tapered-bore anti-tank rifle that fired a scarce tungsten carbide round, Schmid's role was not to engage infantry, but the rules of the manual dissolved in the chaos of actual combat. As the commandos retreated towards their hidden raft, a low silhouette emerged from the tree line on the German bank, an SDKFZ-221 light reconnaissance vehicle, its 2.8-centimeter SPZ-BW-41 anti-tank gun swiveling to provide covering fire. It was a steel beast, but a young one. In that moment, Schmid's world narrowed to a series of mechanical calculations: range, drop, the gun's vicious recoil. The sergeant yelled for him to disengage, but Schmid was already settling the bipod, the cold stock against his cheek. He aimed not for the sloped front plate, but the thinner side armor just behind the front wheel.
The report of the Panzerbuchse was a deafening, sharp crack that split the dawn. The tungsten round pierced the metal with a shower of sparks. The vehicle shuddered, lurched, and smoke began to pour from its seams as the engine block was struck. The covering fire ceased. The surviving commandos, now isolated, were captured. In the aftermath, as the adrenaline ebbed, Schmid stared at the smoldering hulk. The confirmation was profound and personal. A single, well-placed shot from one man could maim a machine of war. Command noted the destroyed vehicle and his cool-headedness, but for Schmid, the lesson was darker. The Germans had probed with a light finger this time. Next time, he knew, staring at the widening stain of oil on the riverbank, it would be a clenched steel fist.
The brittle peace of the Alpine frontier shattered, not with a full-scale invasion, but with a brutal surgical probe designed to test the will of the Swiss army to its core. In the early spring of 1944, under the cover of a dense dawn fog that clung to the valley floors, a reinforced German Kampfgruppe launched a localized raid across a weakly defended sector of the Rhine. This was no border skirmish. It was a concentrated fist of armor and elite mountain troops, Gebirgsjäger, with a simple objective: punch through, sow panic, collapse a section of the defensive line, and retreat with valuable intelligence and prisoners. For Alfred Schmid's unit, holding a forward position in a network of camouflaged bunkers and trench lines, the world dissolved into a hell of noise and confusion in a matter of minutes. First came the monstrous, earth-shaking silhouettes of Panzer IVs, their long 75mm guns spearing through the mist, followed by the distinct, menacing clatter of half-tracks, SDKFZ 251, disgorging infantry. Swiss outposts were overrun or bypassed with shocking speed. The carefully planned fields of fire became useless as the Germans used the fog and terrain with ruthless efficiency. Schmid, manning an observation post, radioed frantic corrections as explosions walked through their positions. He saw a direct hit vaporize a machine gun nest to his left, then another blast silence the anti-tank gun covering the road. The defensive perimeter, a clockwork mechanism of interlocking support, was being dismantled gear by gear. Then came the order to fall back to a secondary line. As his squad began their retreat through a communication trench, a devastating mortar barrage bracketed their position. Not a random stonk, but precisely aimed fire, suggesting a forward observer had already infiltrated. The world became deafening thunder and flying dirt. When Schmid's hearing returned, ringing as if from inside a giant bell, he found himself half buried, his uniform torn and his face wet with blood from a scalp wound. He dug himself out to a scene from a nightmare. The trench was a charnel house. His lieutenant lay nearby, killed by a jagged piece of shrapnel through the chest. Of his 8-man squad, only 3 were moving, one screaming with a shattered leg. Their retreat route was cut off by advancing German infantry, their green-gray uniforms now visible through the dissipating fog. In that moment of absolute desolation, with command structure obliterated and survival instinct screaming at him to melt into the woods, Alfred Schmid's mind did not flood with panic, but with an eerie, glacial clarity. He saw the map of the terrain in his mind's eye. The secondary line was lost. The main force was miles away, unaware of the breach. Retreating now meant leading the enemy deeper, revealing paths of advance. But the rocky, wooded knoll they had just left, its bunker crushed, but its approaches still commanding the narrow valley road, was a lock, and he alone held the key. It wasn't heroism that decided him. It was the cold logic of a watchmaker seeing a single broken pivot that could stop the entire mechanism.
He grabbed the lieutenant's map case, the squad's remaining ammunition bag with its precious Panzerbuchse rounds and grenades, and with a hoarse command to the wounded to stay down, he turned and scrambled back towards the hellmouth, not as a soldier following orders, but as a man embracing a terrible, singular purpose.
Alfred Schmid was no longer a soldier in an army. He was a force of physics, a grim equation of mass, velocity, and terrain. The initial German probe, satisfied with scattering the Swiss outpost, had morphed into a cautious advance. A column of armor, led by a pair of Panzer IVs, began to creep up the winding valley road, believing the path now clear. Schmid, from his perch amidst the jagged rocks above, watched them with the detached focus of a surveyor. He had turned the landscape into a deadly circuit board. He knew the exact distance to the hairpin turn, 287 meters, a downhill shot where the tank's thinner top armor would be exposed for a second as it climbed. His Panzerbuchse 41, now propped on a natural stone cradle, was no longer just a weapon. It was a precision instrument. He waited, his breathing stilled, until the lead tank presented its engine deck. The crack of the shot was swallowed by the mountains, but the result was a visible geyser of sparks and a sudden gout of smoke. The tank shuddered and halted, a metal behemoth instantly transformed into a burning roadblock. Chaos erupted below as German infantry spilled from accompanying half-tracks, scanning the cliffs blindly. But Schmid was already gone, moving through a labyrinth of goat trails and erosion channels he had memorized in the quiet weeks before. He was a phantom, his war reduced to a simple, brutal cycle: reappear, strike at the machinery of war, and vanish before the retaliation could find him. His existence became a solitary grinding rhythm against the steel tide. He used the echoing geography as weapon, firing from one scree slope, only to reappear minutes later on the opposite side of the valley, leveraging the confusion of his own echoes. He targeted not to destroy outright, but to cripple and create chaos. A second shot aimed at a Panzer III's tracks immobilized it, turning it into a second barricade that trapped the vehicles behind it. He harvested opportunities from the enemy's reactions. When a squad of Gebirgsjäger fanned out to root him off the slope, he let them advance, then used a single carefully placed rifle grenade on a rocky overhang above them to trigger a minor avalanche, burying their advance under a cascade of stone and dirt. He scavenged ammunition from the dead, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency. The cold, analytical part of his mind, the watchwaker's son, was in absolute control, calculating angles, wind, and fatigue. Yet a darker, more primal current ran beneath. With each successful strike, a terrifying realization grew. In this absolute solitude, against this impossible odds, he felt a perverse, pure form of freedom. The complexities of a crumbling world, the betrayal of a father, the ambiguity of duty, all were burned away in the furnace of this simple, lethal purpose. He was no longer defending Switzerland. He was asserting a fundamental truth: that one resolute man, fused with the land, could become an indomitable variable. The German advance, meant to be a lightning raid, had stalled completely, tangled in a narrow valley by an invisible, relentless foe who seemed less a man and more a vengeful spirit of the Alps themselves. The valley had transformed into a grotesque, smoldering monument to stalemate. 11 iron carcasses lay scattered along the serpentine road, some burning with low, oily flames, others simply silent and cold, their crews dead, captured, or fled. The German advance had not just stalled, it had been annihilated. But for Alfred Schmid, crouched behind a shattered boulder with blood crusted on his temple and a tremor in his exhausted hands, The battle was narrowing to a single final point of failure. His ammunition was gone. The last tungsten-cored round had been spent hours ago to disable the reconnaissance vehicle attempting to outflank him. All he had left was his Luger pistol with 3 rounds, a single Model 1929 Schützenmine, a powerful Swiss shooter's mine grenade, and a landscape now stripped of its surprises. The Germans, enraged and humiliated, had changed tactics. Instead of sending another column, they deployed a single late-model Sturmgeschütz III assault gun, a low, sleek, turretless beast, all frontal armor and a menacing 75mm gun. It advanced with glacial, terrifying patience, methodically shelling every possible nest and outcrop ahead of it with high explosive rounds. The mountain itself seemed to shudder under the bombardment. Schmid was no longer a hunter. He was prey being flushed out. Shrapnel grazed his calf, a hot, searing pain that promised to slow him fatally. The assault gun was a crawling fortress, and his rifle was useless against its thick, sloped glacis plate. His only chance lay in the one blind spot he had calculated but never hoped to use, the thin, grilled engine deck at the rear. To reach it, he would have to let the metal monster crawl past him, then emerge from hiding and attack from behind, a suicidal maneuver in open ground. As the Stug rumbled past his position, its tracks chewing earth mere meters away, Schmid's mind entered a state of eerie, hyper-lucid calm. The watchmaker's calculations merged with the primal instinct for survival. He waited for the concussion of its next shot, a blast that showered him with dirt and stones, and in that moment of deafness and distraction, he moved. Dragging his wounded leg, he scuttled from cover like a crab, not away, but parallel to the vehicle's path, using the settling dust as a screen. The grenade in his hand felt impossibly heavy. The assault gun's commander, vigilant in his hatch, was scanning forward, not behind. Schmid's plan was not one of precision, but of desperation. He couldn't throw the grenade onto the deck from this angle. He had to place it. He lunged the final few paces as the vehicle began to turn, his body screaming in protest. With a grunt that was more a silent prayer, he jammed the Schützenmine, pin-poled, into the grill of the engine compartment, where the fan blades would suck the blast inward. He then hurled himself sideways, drawling a shallow drainage ditch as the world behind him erupted in a catastrophic roar of shredded metal and igniting fuel. The concussion slammed the air from his lungs. He lay in the ditch, half deaf, half blind, as burning diesel trickled past him like hellish rivulets. The 12th tank was a funeral pyre, casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the canyon walls. Schmid did not feel triumph, only a vast, hollow exhaustion. The mechanism of the German thrust was finally, irrevocably broken, and he, the last stubborn pivot, had held, but at the cost of becoming something other than a man, a tool of destruction, now spent and waiting to be discarded by the very history he had just bent.
The first Swiss patrol to reach the Valley of Death did so with extreme caution, expecting a German ambush, or at best, a scene of total annihilation of their forward company. What they found was a silent, smoke-hazed landscape of shattered steel, and a single, barely conscious man propped against a rock, clutching an empty Luger. Alfred Schmid was almost recognizable. His uniform was in tatters, his face blackened with soot and dried blood, his eyes staring through the rescuers with a 1,000-yard gaze that seemed focused on some internal horror. He did not react to their calls initially, trapped in the deafening silence that had followed the last explosion. When a medic gently pried the pistol from his stiff fingers, Schmid simply whispered, "12, es sind 12. 12, there are 12." The lieutenant in command of the patrol scanned the apocalyptic scene, the smoldering hulks of armor scattered along the road, the gouged earth, the eerie absence of enemy movement, and his initial disbelief hardened into a stunned, cautious awe. Schmid was evacuated on a makeshift stretcher, his body a map of bruises, cuts, and a deep shrapnel wound in his calf. At the field hospital, his story, fragmented and delivered in a monotone, was met not with celebration, but with profound skepticism. The idea that a single soldier, armed with little more than an anti-tank rifle and grenades, could single-handedly stop a reinforced armored column bordered on the fantastical. High Command suspected a confused, shell-shocked survivor, attributing the work of an entire destroyed unit to himself. They filed his debrief as a possible exaggeration and focused on shoring up the breach, quietly preparing for the court-martial of a man they thought had lost his mind along with his unit. The truth, however, was stubbornly material. A detailed combat engineering reconnaissance of the valley days later, once the area was fully secured, provided the cold, hard evidence. The team cataloged not just the wreckage, but the forensic narrative of the battle. They found the distinct drilled holes from Panzerbuchse rounds in specific, vulnerable points of the tanks, turret rings, engine blocks, tracks, consistent with precise aimed fire from multiple elevated angles, not a chaotic barrage. Crucially, they mapped Schmid's positions, the spent casings on the rocky knoll, the scuff marks and drag trails in hidden gullies, the final fateful spot by the drainage ditch littered with fragments of a Swiss grenade, near the utterly destroyed Sturmgeschütz. The story was written in the earth and metal. The official report, once it reached the highest levels of the Swiss military and then the Federal Council, triggered a seismic shift. Schmid was no longer a possible liar, he was a strategic miracle and a potent propaganda symbol. He was awarded the highest honors, not in a grand ceremony, but quietly in his hospital room, his body still racked with fever from infection. The state media, under strict guidelines to maintain morale without provoking Germany, began crafting the legend of the Alpine David, the lone watchmaker's son who defeated a Goliath of steel. Journalists requested interviews, artists sketched heroic depictions, but the man at the center had retreated into a deeper silence. The unexpected twist was not in his survival, but in his reaction to it. When a senior officer leaned over his bed and called him a hero, he turned his head to the wall and replied, his voice hollow. There were no heroes there, only a man who forgot how to surrender, and a lot of boys who burned in their machines. His miracle was not victory, but the unbearable clarity of the cost, a burden that no medal could ever lift.
Alfred Schmid disappeared into the quiet fabric of peacetime Switzerland with the same determination he had once applied to war. He refused all offers of political advancement, lucrative book deals, and a permanent officer's commission. Instead, he returned to the family home, now burdened only by his mother and memories, and took over a small, unassuming machine workshop in the outskirts of Bern. To his neighbors, he was a reserved, impeccably precise mechanic who could fix any engine, but spoke little of his past. The state, however, could not allow its greatest wartime symbol to fade entirely. His story, sanitized and mythologized, became a cornerstone of the national narrative of armed neutrality, a testament to the idea that every citizen soldier, no matter how humble, could become an insurmountable obstacle to aggression. His tactics were studied in military academies. The Schmidt principle of using extreme terrain to offset numerical and technological inferiority entered doctrine. Yet the man himself viewed this canonization with deep unease. He attended annual memorial services under duress, a silent, stone-faced figure standing apart from the politicians and generals, his presence a living reproach to easy glorification. His legacy was not one he chose, but one that was forged from him, like a tool pressed into service for purposes its maker never intended. He had become a monument,
and like all monuments, he felt the slow, corrosive weather of misunderstanding eroding the truth of what he had done and why. The true, unexpected turn in Alfred Schmidt's story came not from historians, but from a Berlin archivist in the early 2000s. Among the declassified files of the German High Command, a brief situation report from that very day in 1944 was found. It detailed the loss of a Kampfgruppe in a secondary Alpine sector, attributing it to unexpectedly fierce resistance from fortified positions and catastrophic terrain. The report's author, a meticulous staff officer, had appended a single, haunting line of speculation based on intercepted, confused Swiss radio traffic and prisoner debriefs. The failure of the operation is preliminarily attributed to the actions of a single, unidentified Swiss observer artillerist whose positioning and rate of fire created a disproportionate tactical effect, verification pending. The verification never came for the Germans, but for modern historians it was a bombshell, the first independent enemy confirmation of Schmidt's lone stand. This dry footnote did more to cement his historical reality than all Swiss propaganda. Yet the deeper legacy is more poignant. In his workshop, found after his quiet death in 1978, among his tools was a simple, carefully maintained pocket watch, his father's. It was repaired, perfectly functional. Schmidt had spent a lifetime fixing the broken mechanism his father had abandoned, just as he had once tried to fix a broken defensive line. His true inheritance was this silent, private act of meticulous repair, a counterpoint to the public legend of spectacular destruction. He remains the man who should not have been, a hero who rejected heroism, a soldier who waged war to preserve peace, and a son who in the end mastered the very craft of precision and reliability his father had forsaken, leaving behind a legacy not of the 12 tanks he stopped, but of the one thing broken he chose, quietly and without fanfare, to make whole again.